And we'll go into the Srimad Bhagavatam in the verse. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. All right, so we are reading from, I hope I have this correct, but I believe I do, Srimad Bhagavatam, chapter 10, Canto 10, chapter 6, verse 33. And we're reading from the section...
And 34, Prabhu, 33 and 34.
33 and 34, yes, that's correct. And we're reading from the section of the Bhagavatam that's speaking to the pastime of Putana, Krishna killing Putana. And there's a lot we can learn from this pastime, so I'll share some realizations that I had. And then, as usual, I would love to hear from all of you, things that you're thinking about as it relates to this pastime, things that we're speaking about today, and how we can apply this. The main thing that I like to bring about, and many of you have seen me here, and we've had the fortune to connect in a Srimad Bhagavatam class, is really thinking about how we can make this applicable to our life. How are we growing? How are we realizing different things from our Shastra and applying it into our life and helping us move forward in our spiritual progress. So I'll just, in the essence of time, I'll just go straight to the translation by Srila Prabhupada. Again, the story of Putana. So the inhabitants of Vraja cut the gigantic body of Putana into pieces with the help of axes. So this is where Putana had already been killed by Krishna. So the inhabitants of Vraja cut the gigantic body of Putana into pieces with the help of axes, and they threw the pieces far away, covered them with wood, and burned them to ashes. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. It is a practice that after a snake has been killed, its body is cut into various pieces for fear that it may come to life again, simply by interacting with air. Merely killing a serpent is not sufficient. After it is killed, it must be cut to pieces and burned, and then the danger will be over. Putana resembled a great serpent, and therefore the coward men took the same precautions by burning her body to ashes. This is this verse 33, and then we'll go to verse 34 as well and read that. Again, the same line this past time. Because of Krishna's having sucked the breast of the Rakshashi Putana, when Krishna killed her, she was immediately freed from all contamination. Her sinful reactions automatically vanished, and therefore, when her gigantic body was being burnt, the smoke emanating from her body was fragrant, like a guru incense. Again, purport by Srila Prabhupada. Such are the effects of Krishna consciousness. If one somehow or another becomes Krishna conscious by applying his senses in the service of the Lord, one is immediately freed from material contamination. Shinvatam Swakatha Krishna Punya Shravana Kirtana. This one, Bhagavatam, 1st Canto, 2nd chapter, 17th verse. Hearing about the activities of Krishna is the beginning of purified life. Punya Shravana Kirtana. Simply by hearing and chanting, one becomes purified. Therefore, in discharging devotional service, Shravana Kirtana, hearing and chanting, is most important. Then, with purified senses, one begins to render service to the Lord Rishikesha Sevanam. Bhakti Rujayate. This is called bhakti. When Putana was somehow or another, directly or indirectly, induced to render some service to the Lord by feeding him with her breast, she was immediately purified, so much so that when her nasty material body was burnt to ashes, it gave off the fragrance of aguru, the most agreeable scented herb. So we'll go back to that first line here. Such are the effects of Krishna consciousness. If one somehow or another becomes Krishna conscious by applying his senses in the service of the Lord, one is immediately freed from material contamination. So we speak on these two verses and the purports by Srila Prabhupada, and share some thoughts. And I'll just briefly give some prayers, and then we'll go right into it. Om Gyantimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshuru Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Prajarine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Prashatate Shatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhaktivinoda Ki Jai. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Ram Ram Hare Hare. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanevyo Vaishnavevyo Namo Namaha. Okay, welcome everyone. So glad to see all of you here. Many familiar faces that I'm seeing from previous times I've been on our sessions, and some new faces as well. So it was so nice. Srimad Bhagavatam and spiritual wisdom is so enlivening to our mind, body, and soul. And so it's so nice to see all of us eager to listen, even on Saturday at 7 a.m. in New York time, at least 7:20, coming on and disciplining ourselves to come on and to hear some spiritual wisdom. So hopefully this can be relevant. And as usual, please share your thoughts in the chat. Love to hear them, realizations if you have any. And then also at the end, we'll open it up for thoughts, for questions, or comments, for realizations. I learned as much from you all as I do preparing for the class, which is really nice as well. So I appreciate hearing from all of you. So the theme that I wanted to share from this story, and these two verses were speaking about Putana and how she was killed, and how the Vrajvasis, they burnt her body, and they cut her body and burnt it, and the symbolism of that. I wanted to talk a little bit about that in terms of how we can apply that to our life. And then also how Srila Prabhupada mentions, and how this verse mentions, the next verse 34, how actually Putana was very fortunate because she engaged in the process of bhakti by unknowingly serving Krishna, although her intent was to kill him. And how we can apply that to our life. Where is that coming up in our life in terms of the anarthas that Putana represents, and then how we can be careful of that in our life. So the theme that I will share is this idea that we need to all start with where we are. Start with where we are in this process of bhakti. And I'll go into this theme and I'll bring it through our session today. It'll become clearer. Because like Putana actually represents the anartha of the false guru, or being duplicitous. Right? She came as, we all know the story, most likely, that she came as this beautifully dressed woman who was mothering Krishna, who wanted to mother Krishna, but her intention, as it said in the Bhagavatam, that she came very beautifully and in this way, but her heart was very cruel and fierce. Right? She has an intent, this very nefarious intent to kill Krishna by smearing poison on herself, on her body. And so there's this duplicity. She comes in this way, but her intention is actually something very different. And I was thinking about this and how sometimes we in our own life, maybe we don't want to do what Putana did per se, but we have duplicitous intentions often. And they're not always cruel, but we're not always lined up necessarily in terms of our highest ideals. And I was thinking that, what are some typical reasons that we act sometimes in this world? We do something. Well, I wrote down a couple of things that come to mind in terms of some of these lower reasons why we act. Maybe it's envy. We're envious of someone. We're envious of what they have, what they can have, how good they are at something. So we're envious. So we're trying to compete with them. We're trying to take what they have. And so the next motivation is competition. We feel a sense of competition from someone because of that envy, that jealousy, and we want to be better than them. That's another reason why many people base their whole life on just being better than others. We're always comparing ourselves to others. Oh, is this person on such and such job, such and such education, income, whatever the case might be. Even in our spiritual communities, this mindset can creep in. We're competing with each other. Oh, this devotee is serving in such and such way, and therefore I need to outdo them. And we won't admit this actually readily, but sometimes we have this mindset, and we can see how this comes about. So there's envy, there's competition, then there's other motivations as well. For example, There's validation. This is a very common one when we're seeking validation from others because we feel a sense of emptiness. So we need others to validate who we are. So we do things so that people can tell us that we're doing great, that we're doing amazing, that we're wonderful. So we're looking for that. Then some other common motivations in this world: money is a very big, obviously, motivator, and also necessary in many ways to survive. We have money, we have fame, chasing opulence, and then greed, where that can translate into greed, where we become impossible to satisfy because nothing is actually nourishing us. We're getting so much, but we're not satisfied. So these are some lower reasons why we act. But what are some higher reasons? What are some higher reasons that we can all act and we all are capable of acting in the process of bhakti? And that's, we know these reasons. There are a couple that I wrote down. There's many, but one is to act as an instrument of service, to others selflessly, and do so without agenda. The actual act of service in itself gives so much joy that that's enough to nourish us, actually. We're not looking for external validation, even if that's there or it's not there. We're not looking to compete with others. We're not looking for money, fame, or opulence, or any validation, etc., as mentioned. But really, just the act of serving is satisfying. And in this vein, similarly, acting out of love and kindness. Again, the act of love, when we're actually self-satisfied, right, Atmarati, then we can actually give without wanting in return, because we're giving from our heart, from this place of love and abundance that we can feel. And then lastly, we can also, in this same vein of love and kindness, we can act out of compassion and empathy. So it's said that the Vaishnava and the sincere spiritualist is para dukkha dukhi, para sukha sukhi, meaning that they feel the happiness of others, but they also feel the pain. And we can see there's so many examples in our disciplic succession, in our spiritual heritage. But Srila Prabhupada, for example, coming over to the West, seeing the pain that so many people must be feeling around the world, and actually acting and serving out of that feeling of pain and suffering, being able to connect with that and having compassion for that. So those are higher reasons to act, and then we have our lower reasons to act. Now the interesting thing is, and I'm just looking at the chat here, yes, we can serve. Yes, Krishna Daya Prabhu, thank you. Acting for the pleasure of the spiritual master. Yes, an act of service. That is absolutely correct as well. So serving someone who's actually developed love. And that's very powerful because that also carries us. So we have these lower reasons, we have these higher reasons. And there's a spectrum of behavior. I found that in my life at least, I'm not always on the lower side, I'm not always on the higher side. I'm somewhere in the middle sometimes, to be honest. And I think that starting with where we are, to avoid this anartha of Putana, of duplicity, is being honest with ourselves. Where are we when we're acting? Sometimes we might be looking for validation. Sometimes envy might come in our heart. Sometimes a sense of competition might come in our heart. So being aware of that, then also knowing when are we acting for some of those higher reasons. But the interesting thing is that Srila Prabhupada mentions that the process of bhakti is purifying to the point where it can purify someone even if they have some ulterior motives. And we see this example in Putana, where she comes in with this ill intention and she actually achieves liberation and achieves Sangha with Krishna. And you can even see examples. We see examples today, and one story that was coming to my mind, where sometimes we have these ill intentions, all of us. And one example that was coming to my mind was, I was reading, I think it was Black Lotus, which is the autobiography of Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj, who obviously has left us a few years back, in 2005, many years back actually now. And he was sharing this story, I think it was in the book, that when he first found out about the devotees, he was studying, he went to Princeton University, and he was a very well-educated young man, and he was studying yoga and Ashtanga yoga and Hatha yoga with some different teachers in the US. And one of his teachers mentioned to him that, this is a very interesting story, one of the teachers mentioned to him that actually there's a teacher who has some of the higher knowledge on the planet, from the highest knowledge. And he said, "Oh, who is this teacher? Because I'm learning so many good things from you and from the teachers I'm learning from." And his teacher mentioned actually that Srila Prabhupada has come from the East, and he has this beautiful wisdom of bhakti and some of the highest knowledge on the planet. And Bhaktitirtha Maharaj at that time, he was John Favors. He wasn't initiated yet, in Ghanasham Das. But when he heard this, and he heard who it was, and he had seen the devotees sometimes on the street chanting Harinam when he was in, I think, New York and other places, and he thought they were kind of interesting, a bit funny. He thought they were wearing bed sheets, and they had these clay markings, and he couldn't really understand it at that time. And he said, "Oh, those people with wearing those bed sheets, and they're wearing this interesting tilak on their forehead and all that. Like they have the higher knowledge." And he said, "Yes, they do." So it's interesting. He went to the temple, and some of you may know this story, but he went to the temple to explore, to investigate this claim. And actually, when he says in his own words, when he first came to the temple, and I think it was in New York, he came as a obviously newcomer, new bhakta, and his whole mindset was to find fault with the devotees. He was to absolutely find fault because he felt like, well, how can this be the highest knowledge and the higher knowledge on the planet? And over many weeks, he was observing, he was trying to find fault, he was trying to find gaps in the philosophy, he was trying to find fault in behavior and different devotees, seeing what's going on. And he found that, okay, you know what? And he says this, that he saw that, okay, yes, there are some imperfections, there's some faults, but many people were practicing sincerely. And this philosophy, this way of life, this heart-to-heart connection with Krishna was actually winning him over. And he was realizing that he had come for one reason, which is to find fault, which is to kind of expose certain things that he thought. But actually, another thing was happening, and he was getting closer to Krishna, he was getting closer to the spiritual community, and his life was getting enriched. And then we all know how the story got completed. He actually joined, and he became eventually His Holiness Bhaktitirtha Maharaj, who served Srila Prabhupada in so many different ways, and served in many, many different ways in creative preaching as well. And so we can see how, just as in this one story, coming in with one mindset, leaving with another, the process of bhakti can actually purify us, very much so. And we can see that. And Krishna says this in the Gita as well. He says that there's 4 types of people that come to him. In the 7th chapter, he mentions that there are 4 types of people. The distressed, he says the artha, the curious, who are those who are seeking knowledge. Then also those who are seeking material assets, wealth. That's the 3rd type. And then those who are wise, the jnanis, who are looking for also some spiritual knowledge, who have some wisdom as well. So 4 types of people that eventually can engage in this devotional service. So sometimes we may come from one of these reasons, and then the reason changes over time because we actually get attracted via our heart, and then we actually want to serve genuinely from our heart. And actually the process of bhakti is specialized in developing love in our heart for Krishna and for each other. So I wanted to share this just from the story of Putana. So Putana, just to recap briefly, she represents this idea of the false guru, this anartha, or this duplicity, that we have this intention, one intention on the outside and one intention on the inside, the pseudo-guru. And we can see how we have this within our own heart, is the point that I'm making, based off the higher reasons we act and the lower reasons we may act, and how we have a spectrum of being and of doing that's not always pure. We're not always pure, and we don't necessarily need to be right off the bat. The process of bhakti is about being honest with where we are, starting with where we are, and then serving and plugging in wherever we are, and then letting the process of bhakti, our practice, our mentors, Krishna, letting them guide us to perfection and to spiritual growth. But this key is really being honest, and I want to talk about this as well. This is a challenge. This is definitely a challenge because sometimes we like to live behind our ideals sometimes. And sometimes we like to hide behind or live behind, not in a bad way, but just naturally we like to hide behind our ideals and strive for those. Because bhakti is a very simple, but it's a very deep and sacred goal. Sometimes we think it's simple and it's easy. It's simple, yes, it can be easy, but it's also very deep and sacred that is actually quite difficult. Krishna says that out of millions of people, only one comes to his path, and then out of those millions, one actually knows him in full, right? So we can see it's not so easy actually. We need to understand that, and we're really striving for pure love for Krishna, for ourselves, for each other, and in many cases we need to really understand what pure love is. And so we have all these ideals in bhakti, like humility, we have compassion, we have seva, we have our sadhana, our disciplines that we have. But we have to understand these properly as it relates to us in the mind, body, spirit complex, I feel. It's so important. And I talk about this a lot. But sometimes I think that in our community, we expect to become instantly purified from these lower motivations. We think that we're going to come into bhakti and instantly we're going to be purified. And that can be the case. That can absolutely be the case. But sometimes it takes time. Srila Prabhupada mentions in many places that the process of bhakti is a gradual process. We gradually become purified. And I wanted to talk about this in some cases because the ego, it's very interesting, but we have to deal with the ego when we are practicing spiritual life. And such is can be a big impediment, but we can use it as a growth point. But the ego has two plays. I was thinking about this and reflecting on this, and to tell me if you agree with this or if you disagree as well, it's fair. But I think that has two plays. Sometimes our ego tells us that we've already imbibed the ideals of bhakti. Sometimes we go overboard. So I call this overboard. Sometimes we go overboard. We think we got it. We think we've mastered it. We've got it down. And so we think we've mastered the ideals. And I've seen this in my own life and also in other. But like thinking about sometimes when we see in our own life when maybe we just joined or we just started practicing spiritual life, sometimes it can be very easy to be judgmental of others, right? Initially, because we think that we've got something super special, which we have, but then we forget that we're still practicing. We're still very new on the path, and all of us are still striving in whatever way we are. And so we kind of can look down on other people, right? So we can go a little overboard sometimes. We think that we've already got it. Srila Prabhupada would say this sometimes, that he would say that the your fault for some of his disciples, I think he mentioned this sometimes, where he would say your fault is that you're not sufficiently afraid of Maya. Actually, you think you've gotten it, and that's actually a very dangerous place to be. So going overboard. The other thing with the ego, the other side of the coin, the other chop, is that we go underboard. So we think that because we have no qualification, that we can't do anything, that we can't serve, that we can't put ourselves out there, we can't share our gifts and our talents, etc., with the world, with our community, etc. Sometimes we go underboard. And this is actually known in psychology. It's something that's been studied a lot. It's called Imposter Syndrome, they call it, where we think that we are not worthy, and it comes from a sense of like lacking confidence in ourselves. And so we tend to hold ourselves back because we feel like we don't deserve to share, to serve, to grow, to be seen, and all of that. So these are the two places. Sometimes we go over or we go under. And I think that, again, being honest, the truth is that we're somewhere in the middle. We're practicing these ideals of bhakti, but these are ideals. So we're still on the path, most of us, unless we're pure devotees and pure practitioners. Those are there, of course. But many of us, and most of us, I feel, in my experience, are continuing to practice. And this is why we're practicing Krishna consciousness. Not that we are completed and we're Krishna conscious fully, but we're practicing every day. It needs to be practiced. And I want to give some examples in this vein of over and under as well, even from our acharyas. And by the way, is this resonating with everyone? Give a little thumbs up if you're resonating with it. Okay, good. Good to see. Thank you all. Love to know that. So, for example, there's dangers with both over and under when it comes to the ego. For example, with going overboard, the issues is that when we focus too much on the ideals of bhakti without being honest with where we are and giving room to ourselves to actually grow into those, then we can suppress our human experience of spiritual life. right? We're also in this body. We're still in this body. Yes, we're more than this body. Yes, we're not this body. But we're also right now currently in the body as well, in the mind. And so we need to be very mindful of this. And so sometimes when we go over it, it can suppress our human experience, our doubts. But if we go underboard, also, that's also a challenge, because then we're holding ourselves back. We're holding ourselves back from giving fully because we feel like we're not qualified. And we're actually robbing the community of some valuable gifts. And I'll give some examples. One is I was just reading Chasing Rhinos with the Swami by Shyam Sundar Prabhu. Very nice book. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen it or read it. And he gives such a nice anecdote, actually, of Srila Prabhupada, which I thought I wanted to bring in to show how we need to really balance and make sure that we're not getting callous behind the ideals of bhakti, and we're not losing ourselves in just chasing that, but also allowing for that human experience. So he mentions how in the beginning of actually the first volume, how one of his disciples is with Srila Prabhupada, and Srila Prabhupada had just received a letter, and the letter from India is stating that his sister is very ill, Srila Prabhupada's sister. And one of his disciples, actually Janaki Prabhu, sees Srila Prabhupada in a very sad mood, very melancholy. He's sitting there with the letter in his hand. And she asks him, okay, Srila Prabhupada, what's the deal, Swamiji? And this is the early days of the movement, of course. And he mentions that my sister is very ill, and I'm feeling sad about that. And she might pass away actually soon. And Janaki Prabhu mentions to Srila Prabhupada that she asks Srila Prabhupada sincerely that, we know that we're not this body, but I see that you're sad, quite sad to see that, getting this news. How is it the case if we're not this body? How are the two things equivalent? And how is that there? And I really appreciated Srila Prabhupada's response. It was such a beautiful response, and I wanted to share it with all of you. He said, in response, he said this to her. He said, "You must learn to appreciate the human condition and how much attachment we develop for one another. Yes, we are not this body, but the attachment is still there." Right? The attachment is still there. So again, reconciling these two opposites. Srila Prabhupada going right in the middle, perfectly, of yes, we're not this body, but yes, there's also attachment. So we need to leave room for that. We cannot go overboard. And another story that was coming to my mind, similarly, was I remember many years back I was speaking to one of my friends, it's actually at the Bhakti Center, and it was like a mentor to me. And I was mentioning that I've grown up, I've seen our spiritual communities and having a chance to do kirtan and really loving the practice of that and many different things, but I was kind of hitting a wall where I felt like I didn't really have any taste for connecting and chanting, even though I was doing this for so many years. And I felt very nervous bringing it up to this devotee, actually, because I didn't want to be judged for that, and I felt like it was kind of a vulnerable thing to share. And it was such a nice response that I had received from them that I felt like sharing today, actually. So I shared with them, that I've been chanting for so many years, and I've been finding that I'm hitting a wall, and I honestly don't have much taste to chant. And the devotee said to me that, he looked at me and said that it's actually really good that you're having this realization. And he didn't belittle me or judge me for this. We said that actually when you're getting to this place of doubt and you're having to dig in deeper in a more meaningful way, your connection, that's actually a good thing, because long term you're actually having some very necessary spiritual growth for yourself. Now think about this. When I shared this doubt with that individual, it could have gone so many different ways. Devotee could have said, well, clearly you're not doing the right thing, you're having issues, or you're having some doubts, or whatever the case might be. They could have shut it down, they could have dismissed it, they could have judged me. All that would have hurt me in the moment, because I would have felt that, right? I would have felt that energy. And I was sincerely asking. But in fact, they invited me further on the path. Actually, you know what? This is a very normal experience. It's actually good you're having this at this point, because it will help you go deeper in creating a meaningful connection to Krishna. So you can use this as an experience. And I remember feeling very seen and very heard in that case, and actually helped me go deeper instead of pushing me away. So again, the point that I'm trying to make here is that while we're being honest with ourselves, it's so important that we don't go overboard, we don't sell ourselves short and go underboard, but that we're able to reconcile where we are on our spiritual path, and being honest with where we are, and then moving forward from there. And it's interesting because sometimes we want to judge ourselves. We want to judge ourselves, or even judge others, sometimes on the path of spiritual growth. But I feel like we actually really need to meet our struggles with more empathy and compassion versus actually judgment, and more curiosity. So, in other words, as we're pursuing the ideals of bhakti, there's nothing wrong with that. It's important, it's necessary. We want to be mindful of leaving room for this. And actually, the antidote to judgment is curiosity and compassion. When we're curious and we're compassionate to ourselves. There's a famous psychologist, Carl Rogers. This is a very interesting quote, but I really like this quote, and I applied it in my own life as well. He says that the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. It's very interesting. The curious paradox is when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. Now, this doesn't mean that we give ourselves unlimited leeway to go back into bad habits. It's not meaning that. But it means that we need to be honest and kind to ourselves first. And then we can actually change and grow. Because when we are very judgmental to ourselves or others, we're actually stifling growth. That's the point. And I wanted to just wrap up with a couple more points and then open it up for some questions. But I also wanted to talk about this point around sometimes we have in our community, we talked about judgment and also discernment. Right? So sometimes we think that we are discerning, but we're actually judging others. Right? And this is a very important point to know. We're judging ourselves. Discernment is very important on the spiritual path. It's very important. And discernment is about evaluating a situation or a person or a request or whatever the case might be for alignment, to see if there's an alignment of values. But judgment is when we're evaluating for comparison. This is my thought. And whether we're inferior or we're superior, generally superior in judgment. We want to look down upon others. Right? And this is something we need to be very mindful of as we are in this process of spiritual growth, that we're not getting to this judgment category. We all do it, definitely. I think it's a very subconscious item, but we want to be mindful of that. And discernment is important, but judgment is something we need to be mindful of. Just like, let's say, so we're all at a program and having some nice sangha, and someone comes along and says that there's a wonderful event going on, late night party or something in New York City, which there's so many, right? You know, you go down the street from downstairs from the Bhakti Center, and there's so many things going on. Someone invites us to one of those gatherings. Now, there's a difference between us saying, and so let's say they're just inviting us, and from, you know, they're a little naive and innocent, etc. There's a big difference between us being discerning and saying, is this going to this event aligned with my values? Going to this scene aligned with my values? I don't think it is. I actually like to get to bed on time. I want to get up tomorrow to have my sadhana. I don't think that the energy of this environment is conducive to my spiritual life. Versus sometimes our mindset can be judgment, right? And it's very different. Judgment looks like we might look at the other person who invited us and say, how could this person be doing this such and such thing? How lowly of them. They're so neophyte, or that's not a very spiritual or Vaishnava-like move, right? We almost condemn them in our mind. We want to be very mindful of that. That's something that we all need to be careful of. Well, again, this idea between discernment and judgment is very, very important to take note of. It's a subtle difference, but sometimes we think that we're being discerning, but we're actually being judgmental. And discerning is actually really important on the spiritual path, but judgment is actually harmful on the spiritual path. So these are some thoughts there, and I just wanted to wrap up with some points. So we just recap real quickly what we talked about. So we talked about the story of Putana, the anartha that Putana represents, and the duplicity, the false guru, pseudo guru. We talked about the idea that, and the not even the idea, the fact that bhakti yoga is so powerful that we can start with even a lower level of motivation, whether it's validation, recognition, fame, money, and competition, envy, whatever the case might be, and it can purify us into a higher level of motivation acting over time. Desire to be of selfless service, of an instrument of loving kindness, serving our guru, compassion, empathy, all of that. We shared one story of His Holiness Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj and how when he came in, he had a certain mindset, and then over time it transformed. We talked about the four reasons why people come to Krishna, as Krishna says in the Gita, and how with our ego we need to be mindful of going overboard and under. And we don't want to hide behind the ideals and become callous in our hearts, hiding behind the ideals of bhakti. We need to make room for being who we are, being human, but then also striving for these ideals at the same time. It's very much a balancing act between the two. And we also don't want to go underboard where we're not serving with our whole heart, with our confidence to serve Krishna. And then we talked about some examples of Srila Prabhupada, and he mentions his attachment for his sister, and how he's mentioning that in the same vein of spiritual philosophy of we're not this body, accepting ourselves just as we are, we can actually change. That quote by Carl Rogers. And then the difference between judgment and discernment. How we sometimes think that we're actually being discerning, but we're actually being judgmental. And it's very harmful in our spiritual life because we think we're better than others. And that's a very slippery slope that we're on when we get to that place. Just to wrap up, given that, it's really important that we start with where we are to avoid becoming like the false guru or the false practitioner, talk about Putana. We want to start with where we are. This takes a level of honesty, self-introspection, talking about these qualities, accountability, and most of all, sincerity. Srila Prabhupada mentioned sincerity as such an important quality in many places. Because when we're sincere, we actually have a pure heart. Even if we're imperfect, we're all imperfect, but we have a sincere heart, we can serve Krishna. And Krishna really actually looks for that sincerity. And then I just wanted to say one thing on this idea of the Vrajvasis, how they cut the body of Putana and then they burned it. And Srila gives the example of a serpent, and how you need to make sure that you actually kill a serpent. You cannot just kill them, but you have to really make sure you take care of the serpent by burning the body, etc. And what was coming to my heart when I was reading this purport by Srila Prabhupada is that we talked about the anarthas and how each of the demons in Vrindavan represents an anartha in our heart that we can purify. That just like Putana's body needed to be cut many times and then burned and really very like diligently taken care of and like removed, right? Because and you see the Vrajvasis very diligently taking care of this these last rites for Putana, if you will. We actually need to really take care of the garden of our heart for the seed of bhakti to grow. We talk about the Bhakti Lata beach, the seed of bhakti. And there's this idea that's been talked about by many devotees, and we have it in our Shastra, of this seeds in our weeds, right? For the seed of bhakti to grow, also in that same garden, many weeds can grow. Many weeds are already there, to be honest, right? And so when we're tending this seed, these weeds are growing. We need to be mindful that these weeds don't grow too much where we think that they become the plant itself, actually, and they become an obstacle on the path of bhakti. And so it's not like if any of you had a garden, that we just pluck the weeds once. Just like if we're showering or we're exercising, we don't want to shower once, a month, or we shower once in a year, or once in a lifetime. We shower every day. We exercise regularly. And the point is that this is a daily practice. And so this example of the Vrajvasis reminded me very much so, and Srila Prabhupada talks about this in the purport, how we need to be diligent in this way, and really keeping good emotional and spiritual hygiene is key. Keeping a good emotional and spiritual hygiene is key. Just like we keep bodily hygiene physically, we need to also constantly be checking in this vein. And going back to the motivations, we constantly checking in of where are we? What, being honest again, where are we at, and how can we take that and eventually purify that? And even if we're at a lower level of motivation, that's fine. We can also accept that. Potentially, that's where we are right now, and see how we can raise that up to serve Krishna in a more pure way. So I wanted to end there and open it up for any questions, any comments, any thoughts. Um, Thank you all for listening. I hope this was helpful class and some wisdom that pulled together around the story of Putana and Krishna, and how Krishna actually he shows how to also deal with all the demons and these anarthas and take care of them very swiftly as well. Thank you all. Okay, so we have, let's see in the chat, and I see one hand raised, Krishna Prabhu. Okay, yes, so Bhakta Hugyo says, asking, does this align with my values? Yes, that's key. And that's discernment, is making sure it lines up with our values versus when we're judging. It's usually for a sense of comparison based off superiority, generally, or being inferior as well. Prabhu, Krishna Prabhu, you had a question, and then Jamuna Jaya, please, love to hear from you as well.
Yes, so keep it short. Yeah, thank you for the wonderful class. So you are saying that those things which are not favorable or unaligned to the spiritual path, by practice of spiritual path, so we get properly aligned. Thank you for saying that. So as a practicing spiritualist, so one thing is we focus on our practices, and then do we need to also simultaneously explore like what are the things which we are doing which are not favorable,
Yeah.
Work on them, and then how do we understand like those things, who will tell us like what are the faults we are committing?
Thank you for your question. Both are important. Our sadhana is important, our seva is important, our sangha is important, uh, and in the context of all that, we also need to be doing some of our own work as well. And it's important um, because some of these anarthas, they need to be removed from our heart by ourselves. Actually, Bhaktivinoda Thakur talks about this, I believe. He mentions that, and so we need to be mindful of that and tending our own garden. I would say when it comes to how we do that, one is the practice of self introspection. So, self introspection is a key skill on the path of bhakti and on the spiritual path, where we're being able to look within and actually see what our motivation is. Right? We have the mirror of the mind. We get to see ourselves, and there's a lot of dust on the mirror. But the more we practice, like tuning into that, I found in my own practice and my own life, it can be painful. Sometimes we see a lot of dust. It can be a little ugly, a lot of ugly sometimes. But it's also important to continue to look within and building that practice of introspection. That muscle will get stronger over time to be able to do that. What's also really helpful is being around people who also do that. So people who also have very honest conversations around the path and what things they're doing well, what things they're not, what they're struggling with, what some of their doubts are, what some of their anarthas that they're still struggling with. Being around those people can be like a lifesaver because we also get to learn from that level of introspection as well, and we can apply it to our own life. So I think that's a key skill. The more you do it, the easier it will become as you're also doing all the other things in the process of bhakti as well. So that to me is one of the keys, and then also having some uplifting sangha that will also very much help you with people that you can model yourself around. Even honestly, if that's one or two people, three people, it doesn't have to be. Sometimes we think of sangha as 10, 15, 20, 30 people that we're meeting with every week and that are uplifting us. That's there and that's great. But even if we have one or two people that we can really be honest with in our life, actually that's such a big blessing, to be honest. That's what I found in my life. And so that can really help. Does that answer your question in a nutshell?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Any other Vivo?
I think we're at time.
Yes.
I just wanted to thank you. I just want to say really quickly something Raghunath Kappa says about this thing about accepting where we are. He says that we're all in the shower, and that we get in the shower because we're dirty, and some of us are still quite dirty because the water isn't hit. Some are cleaner, some are quite clean. But I love that analogy. We're all in the shower, and that we're all trying to get clean. And I love that analogy, as you're saying about like how to not be judgmental and be true to ourselves. I just want to add that. Beautiful class. Thank you.
Yes, very, very true. And when we recognize that we are, I find that it's easier to not be judgmental toward others and to ourselves because we know that we're all also just working through the same struggles, actually. Very much so. We're all, whether we're further along or behind, whatever the case might be, from others, that's irrelevant, really, actually. It's where we are, and we're also just struggling with the same things, actually. Any other last thoughts?
It's a co-ed shower. We're in a co-ed shower.
Go ahead.
Okay, back to Hugo. Let's do it.
I really appreciate, well, two things, the overboard and underboard. One reflection that I've had in recent times, I've really been meditating on, is that for the devotee who's truly imbibe bhakti, there's a protection in our philosophy from that, where, you know, we don't become egoistic because we understand Krishna is the supreme controller. I'm nothing in the face of that, you know, what have you. So that's the protection on one side. And on the other side, we have Krishna and the spiritual master guiding us. And so it doesn't matter how unqualified we think we are, we're like borrowing, we're getting a loan of qualification from the spiritual master, from Krishna, from our parampara. So it's like, well, it doesn't matter how low I am or what I don't know. If I just surrender sincerely, then I have the most powerful support. And then the other thought as well with duplicity. Yesterday, I was actually speaking with my chaplain at my work, and somehow I asked him about his life and his like personal journey, and he somehow kind of did some jujitsu and like thrust it back on me and started inquiring into my heart. So that was very interesting. But I was kind of explaining my faith, and it's very difficult because I can't really say I'm a Hindu. I can't, you know, I don't really say Krishna because no one understands that. I don't, you know, it just all gets vague and abstract because people don't have an understanding of it that I can work off of. And he kind of pointed that out, and he was challenging to me. And he said that if you have your savior, if you have your Lord, you know, and you have conviction in that, then everyone should be able to see it. Because when you see a child, you know if they have a father or not. You know, a child says, "Oh, I have a father." And it's like, well, then where's your lunch money? Why are your clothes so dirty? Why are you so untaken care of? And on the other hand, you have the child that says, "Oh, I have a father," and you see they're wearing nice clothes and they're happy and they're joyful and they have food and they're well fed and everything. So in the same way, he was kind of speaking about how, like, we should, again, does this align with our values? We should be able to show that we're devotees, show that we're Vaishnavas by our actions. And that comes from that process of anartha vritya, like really introspection, digging deep in ourselves, because you can only wear a mask for so long. Eventually, someone's going to see through that mask. And then it's the question, are you the same as the personality that you present, or are you duplicitous? So appreciating those points. Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Wonderful class.
Thank you. And that's such a good point. It's actually easier to be honest because it's painful up front, but then it's easier on the back end because you get to just be who you are and you don't have to pretend to be someone you're not, and etc. And so I love that point. And then also your point around confidence as well of like, I think it's such a balance of having confidence and humility at the same time. And I think real humility is actually having confidence. Like we look at Srila Prabhupada, he had all the humility in the world knowing that Krishna was providing everything, but that gave him all the confidence in the world of knowing that. And so it's what they call, nowadays they call it grounded confidence. We actually know this in our Shastra, but it's like having confidence that's not based off of external factors totally, like how we look or how intelligent we are, because all those things are varying degrees. We'll always meet people who are more intelligent, who are better looking, who have it together more. But so if we base our confidence based off that, we're always going to be in a deficit because we'll meet someone that like completely makes us feel insecure about that. But if we can be confident in the fact that, yes, we have some of those things for sure, we can be intelligent, we can be well read, etc., and we should prepare our best and really hone our gifts, but then also know that Krishna will carry what we lack, and that we can surrender onto him also as well. That can get us through. So I like that point of like being able to balance both of those is I think it's an art actually, very much so. Thank you.
There's one more in the chat from Eric. Eric is a very new devotee. He's literally a few months old in his bhakti path. He's asking how we discern the difference between false and true gurus. I'll see him today. I'll tell him what you say. He's no longer on the call.
He's on the call. Yeah, it's a challenge. I'd say that sincerity of heart will lead you into the right place, generally speaking. And we can observe what I use, personally speaking. It's a very personal question. But I think if we're sincere, Krishna will lead us in the right places. Sometimes we have to go through some bad experiences as well. I've also seen that with devotees in different places and different times. We've seen in the past, etc. Being honest here as well. I think that though, for me, it's about being sincere, and then also for me, observation is very key. So when we see people in our life, and when we say gurus, it doesn't have to be in my mind and heart. It doesn't have to be necessarily just a Diksha guru. And we have that in our life, but sometimes it's hard to maybe have a personal relationship with Diksha guru because they're so busy, or they're traveling, or so many disciples, etc. So we have many Shiksha gurus. We have people in our community that are inspiring mentors, I like to call them. And I think that being able to observe qualities, and first off, when we cultivate qualities in our own heart, we can see those in others as well, right? And we can see, like Putana, for example, obviously this pastime happens because of the Yogmaya potency of the Lord, and it's said in the Bhagavatam, where she comes into the house and no one even stops her, right, from coming in. And so these are all happening by the arrangement of the Lord. But if it wasn't, we can tell that there's something off, right, about like Putana based off her appearance and her coming in and all of that. And so if we're able to observe qualities of others, individuals, as we cultivate it within ourselves, we can see certain things. That if we see that, how is this person behaving with others? How are they treating others? How are they treating others that who can't really give anything to them? It's also a nice indicator where there's nothing to stand to gain from. That can tell you about another person. We can see how they're serving their spiritual master, what their intention is, their mood is. I think all of that will help you understand. Of course, though, we're also not responsible for another person's spiritual life. And that's something important to also note. We can try our best to discern who can be good sangha for us, who can be good teachers, but also that person has their own spiritual life, their own connection with Krishna, their own process that they're going through, right? So I think that like leaving room for that also too. Sometimes we put others on a pedestal, on a high pedestal, and then they inevitably disappoint us sometimes. So that's also something to be mindful of as well. But those are some thoughts. I think that's a deep discussion, deep point for sure. But I think observation of qualities, seeing their sincerity of service to Krishna Guru, Prabhupada, even if there are some faults, because there's some faults always in this world. No one is perfect. But seeing that, also as we cultivate qualities, we become better at seeing those qualities and seeing who's cultivating what, basically, in their heart as well. And all of that. And then again, we're also not responsible for people's spiritual life. And the last thing I'd say is also seeing how we feel when we spend time with someone. Seeing how we feel. I'm sure we all have devotees or friends in our life that when we spend time with them, we come away supercharged, and we come away feeling motivated. We come away feeling like we can do this, that life, spiritual life, that life, we can do this together. We have the strength, we have the joy, the inspiration to do it. And then we have certain people we might spend time with. We walk away feeling extremely drained. We feel like it's kind of, and maybe it's not even them. Maybe it's just the connection that it's not so inspiring, right? It's not necessarily a personal thing, but it may not be so inspiring for us, that energy. As we walk away, we're feeling drained. We might feel not so inspired, etc. We can see that also, and that can be a good indication. Okay, maybe this person is not for me. This is not exactly my connection, but maybe it can be someone else's connection, etc. So those are some thoughts from my end.
Great, thank you. I will enroll Eric in ISKCON Disciple course.
That's Andrea. Thank you.
Okay,
Awesome.
we can take one more, dear devotees. We have a very qualified presenter today. Let's take advantage.
Thank you all. I'm just trying to share from my heart, honestly, and I'm actually not so qualified, to be honest, but somehow this service, and so I appreciate you all asking sincerely and engaging and trying my best to answer.
Okay. All right. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Anuj Sharma Prabhu ki jai. The corporate bhakti coach. Hare Krishna. Beautiful class. Thank you, Prabhu.
Thank you
very much.
Okay, take care. Thank you, everyone.
Krishna.
Bye. Thank you.
Haribol. Thank you so much.